The autumn
This
rain
is more
hammered against the
serious than we
towering
thought.
windows of
I know,
Kensington
we must
Palace
handle
as
this with
Prince
care.
Alexander stood in his private study.
This is
His
more
jaw
serious than
clenched
we
tight
thought.
as he read
I
the
agree.
morning
We must be
newspapers.
prepared.
Each
What are our
headline
next
felt
steps?
like a dagger thrust into
We
the
must
heart of the
remain
monarchy he
steadfast.
had sworn
Indeed,
to
together
protect.
we are stronger.
Prince Edward's
agree.
gambling
As always.
scandal rocks Palace,
It's a
screamed the front
beautiful
page
day
of
for
the
a
Royal
walk.
Times,
Indeed
while
it
beneath
is.
it,
I'm glad we could
smaller
take
but
this
equally
time.
damaging stories
This meeting
detailed
is
his
crucial.
younger
We must be
brother's
prepared.
mounting debts,
I agree, the
questionable
implications are far-reaching.
associations,
Let's
and
proceed.
increasingly erratic behavior. Princess Elena entered quietly, her elegant steps barely audible on the Persian carpet. She had learned to read her husband's moods over their 15 years of marriage, and the tension radiating from his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, she moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his arm in a gesture both comforting and grounding. The warmth of her touch seemed to anchor him in the moment, pulling him back from the spiral of anger and frustration that threatened to consume him. "How bad is it this time?" Elena asked softly, though she could already see the answer written in the harsh lines of Alexander's face. The morning light filtering through the heavy curtains cast deep shadows under his eyes, evidence of yet another sleepless night spent strategizing damage control for his brother's latest transgression. Alexander's voice was heavy with exhaustion and disappointment as he spoke. "The gambling debts alone total nearly £3 million. But that's not the worst of it." He turned the page with deliberate slowness, as if hoping the words might change if he gave them time. "There are photographs of Edward leaving a private casino at 3 in the morning, clearly intoxicated, accompanied by individuals with known criminal connections. The press is already drawing parallels to scandals that nearly brought down other European monarchies." Elena's breath caught as she absorbed the full scope of the crisis. This wasn't merely another embarrassing incident that could be swept under the royal carpet with a carefully worded statement and a strategic charitable appearance. This was a threat to the very foundation of the institution they had dedicated their lives to serving. The monarchy had survived world wars, constitutional crises, and social revolutions, but in the modern age of instant communication and social media, scandals spread like wildfire, and public opinion could shift in a matter of hours. The couple stood in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they were facing a pivotal moment in their reign. Alexander had ascended to the throne 5 years earlier following his father's abdication due to health concerns, and he had worked tirelessly to modernize the monarchy while maintaining its dignity and relevance. Elena had been his perfect partner in this endeavor, using her background in international relations and her natural charisma to strengthen diplomatic ties and champion causes close to the people's hearts. "We cannot allow Edward to destroy everything our family has built over centuries," Alexander said finally, his voice carrying a steel resolve that Elena recognized from their most challenging moments as working royals. "The crown is bigger than any individual, including members of our own family." Elena nodded slowly, her mind already beginning to formulate the difficult decisions that lay ahead. "The people trust us to be responsible stewards of the monarchy. If we allow Edward's behavior to continue unchecked, we're not just failing in our duty to the crown, we're betraying every citizen who believes in what this institution represents." As if summoned by their conversation, a sharp knock echoed through the study. Sir James Morrison, the king's private secretary, entered with his characteristic efficiency, carrying a leather portfolio that Elena knew contained the latest intelligence from the palace's extensive network of advisors, security personnel, and media contacts. Sir James had served the royal family for over 2 decades, and his discretion and political acumen had helped navigate numerous crises, though none quite as potentially devastating as this. "Your Majesties," Sir James began, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern, "I'm afraid the situation has deteriorated significantly since our last briefing. The Prime Minister's office has been in contact, expressing grave concerns about the potential impact on the government's stability. 3 major tabloids are preparing exposé pieces for tomorrow's editions, and our usual channels for managing press coverage have been less effective than hoped." Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The symbiotic relationship between the monarchy and the government meant that royal scandals inevitably became political crises, potentially weakening Britain's position on the international stage and undermining public confidence in democratic institutions. The careful balance that kept the constitutional monarchy functioning required public respect for the royal family, and that respect was built on a foundation of dignity, service, and moral authority. "What specific evidence do they have?" Elena inquired, her diplomatic training evident in her measured tone despite the gravity of the situation. She understood that knowledge was power in these circumstances, and accurate information would be essential for crafting an effective response strategy. Sir James opened his portfolio and extracted several photographs and documents. Security footage from the Belmont Casino showing Prince Edward placing bets that exceed his known income by substantial margins. Financial records obtained through unnamed sources indicating loans from individuals with ties to organized crime. Testimony from staff members at various establishments detailing incidents of aggressive behavior when intoxicated. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and Alexander felt a familiar ache in his chest as he contemplated the pain this would cause his mother, the Queen Mother, who had already endured so much scandal and heartbreak during her long life.
She had always maintained that the royal family's greatest strength was its unity, but Edward's actions were forcing them to choose between family loyalty and institutional survival. "There's something else," Sir James continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper.
"Intelligence services have briefed me on concerns that Prince Edward may be vulnerable to blackmail or coercion due to his debts and associations. This isn't merely a matter of public embarrassment. It could potentially compromise national security." Elena's face paled as the full implications became clear. A member of the royal family with access to sensitive information and ceremonial responsibilities could become a liability that foreign powers or criminal organizations might exploit. The monarchy's role in state functions and diplomatic ceremonies meant that any compromise of a senior royal could have far-reaching consequences for Britain's security and international relationships. Alexander walked to the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds of Kensington Palace where tourists and photographers maintained their constant vigil. Those people represented the millions of citizens who looked to the royal family for stability, continuity, and moral leadership in an increasingly uncertain world. The thought of betraying their trust was almost unbearable, but the alternative, allowing Edward's destructive behavior to continue, could be even more devastating. "We need to consider options that previous generations never had to contemplate," Alexander said slowly, each word carefully measured. "The monarchy has always been about duty above personal feelings, about service to the nation above family loyalty. If Edward cannot or will not change his behavior, then we must be prepared to take action that protects the institution, regardless of the personal cost." Elena joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Stripping him of his titles and removing him from the line of succession would be unprecedented in modern times, she observed quietly. The constitutional implications alone would require extensive consultation with Parliament and the Commonwealth realms. But if we don't act decisively, we risk allowing the cancer to spread until it destroys everything we've worked to preserve and strengthen. The decision they were contemplating would reverberate through history, setting precedents for how the monarchy dealt with internal threats to its survival. Alexander understood that his reign would be defined not just by his achievements in modernizing the crown, but by his willingness to make the hardest choices when the institution's survival was at stake. The weight of 1,000 years of royal history pressed down upon his shoulders as he prepared to embark on a course of action that would test every principle he held dear. The grand drawing room at Windsor Castle had witnessed countless historic moments over the centuries, but the atmosphere during the emergency family meeting felt particularly charged with tension and gravity. Queen Mother Victoria sat in her favorite armchair, her aged hands folded carefully in her lap, while her eyes reflected the pain of watching her family fracture. At 87, she had weathered numerous storms during her long life, but nothing had prepared her for the prospect of formally exiling one of her own grandchildren to preserve the monarchy. Prince Edward arrived 30 minutes late, his appearance disheveled and his movements carrying the telltale signs of someone struggling with substance abuse. His once handsome features were marred by stress lines and the sallow complexion of too many late nights and poor choices. Alexander felt his heart sink as he observed his younger brother's deterioration, remembering the bright, enthusiastic young man who had once shown such promise as a working royal. "I suppose you've all decided my fate before I even walked through the door," Edward said with bitter defiance, throwing himself into a chair without observing the proper protocols that had been drilled into him since childhood. His voice carried the harsh edge of someone who felt cornered and was prepared to lash out at anyone within reach. Elena exchanged a meaningful glance with Alexander, both of them recognizing that Edward's defensive posture would make the conversation even more difficult than anticipated. They had hoped that confronting him with the evidence and the potential consequences might shock him into acknowledging the severity of his situation. But his belligerent attitude suggested he was too far gone to accept responsibility for his actions.
Edward, we're here because we love you, and because we're desperate to find a solution that doesn't destroy everything our family has worked to build. Alexander began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. The evidence of your gambling, your associations, your debts, it's all documented and about to become public knowledge.
We're not here to judge you, but we need to understand how we got to this point and what you're willing to do to address it. Edward's laugh was harsh and humorless. Oh, please spare me the concerned brother routine, Alex. You've been looking for an excuse to cut me loose since you took the throne. Don't pretend this is about anything other than protecting your precious image and Elena's political ambitions. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be painful. Alexander had indeed grown frustrated with Edward's increasingly erratic behavior and the constant drain it placed on palace resources and media strategy. But the suggestion that he wanted to abandon his brother was deeply unfair, given the countless attempts to provide Edward with support, professional help, and alternative paths for contributing to royal duties. Queen Mother Victoria's voice cut through the tension with the authority that only comes from decades of navigating royal crises. Edward, you will speak respectfully in this family meeting, or you will leave immediately. Your behavior has brought shame upon a crown that has endured for over a millennium, and your attitude suggests you have no appreciation for the gravity of the situation. The rebuke from his grandmother seemed to penetrate Edward's defenses in a way that his brother's diplomatic approach had not. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment the facade of angry bravado slipped to reveal the frightened, overwhelmed man underneath. Elena recognized this as a potential opening for productive dialogue and leaned forward slightly, her expression compassionate but serious. Edward, we've obtained copies of the documents that will be published tomorrow, Elena said gently but firmly. The gambling debts total £2.8 million, money you don't have and can't possibly repay through legitimate means. The photographs show you in compromising situations with individuals who are under investigation for money laundering and racketeering. This isn't something we can spin or manage with traditional crisis communication strategies. Sir James Morrison, who had been standing discreetly near the fireplace, stepped forward with a folder containing the most damaging evidence. He placed it on the coffee table between the family members, and Edward's face grew pale as he recognized several of the photographs and documents. The reality of seeing his transgressions laid out so starkly seemed to break through whatever denial had been sustaining him. These people you've been associating with, they're not just unsavory characters looking for excitement, Alexander continued, his voice heavy with concern. Intelligence services believe they may be using you to gain access to information about royal schedules, security protocols, and government briefings. Whether you realize it or not, you may have already compromised national security. Edward's hands began to shake as he flipped through the documentation, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I wouldn't deliberately. They said they were just businessmen looking for investment opportunities. You thought wrong. Queen Mother Victoria interrupted sharply. And your naive thinking has put not just yourself at risk, but every member of this family, and potentially the entire constitutional framework of our government. These people prey on weakness and vulnerability, and you've given them everything they need to destroy us. The weight of his grandmother's words seemed to crush what remained of Edward's defiant spirit. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, as the full scope of his situation became undeniably clear. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock and Edward's labored breathing as he struggled to process the consequences of his choices. Elena felt genuine sympathy for her brother-in-law, despite the chaos he had created. She understood that addiction and gambling problems were medical conditions that required treatment, not moral failings that deserved condemnation. However, her primary responsibility was to the monarchy and the millions of people who depended on its stability and integrity. We've arranged for a private treatment facility in Switzerland, Alexander said quietly. It's completely confidential, staffed by the best addiction specialists in Europe, and you could begin recovery immediately. But Edward, this cannot be a temporary fix or another false start. If you're going to overcome this, you need to commit completely to the process, regardless of how long it takes. Edward looked up with desperate hope in his eyes. And my titles? My position in the family? What happens to all of that? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Alexander and Elena had spent countless hours discussing this exact scenario, weighing the competing demands of justice, mercy, and institutional preservation. The decision they had reached was perhaps the most difficult of their entire marriage, but they both understood it was necessary. Your titles and royal privileges will be suspended pending the successful completion of treatment and a comprehensive review of your fitness to represent the crown. Elena explained with careful precision. This isn't a punishment, Edward. It's a recognition that the monarchy requires its members to meet certain standards of conduct and reliability. Until you can demonstrate that you've addressed the underlying issues that led to this crisis, you cannot be trusted with the responsibilities that come with royal status. Edward's reaction was immediate and explosive. You're banishing me. You're destroying my entire identity, everything I've ever been, for the sake of protecting your own political interests. This is exactly what I expected from both of you. Sacrifice the inconvenient family member to save yourselves. Alexander's patience finally reached its breaking point. Your identity isn't defined by your title, Edward. Your worth as a human being doesn't depend on whether you're addressed as Your Royal Highness or whether you get to cut ribbons at shopping center openings. What defines you is your character, your choices, and your willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. The shouting match that erupted might have continued indefinitely if Queen Mother Victoria hadn't slammed her walking stick against the floor with surprising force. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot, immediately silencing both brothers and reminding them of where they were and what was at stake. Enough, she commanded with the voice that had once addressed Parliament during wartime. This family has survived the abdication crisis, 2 world wars, and countless political upheavals, and we will survive this as well. But only if we remember that our personal feelings and family loyalty must always come second to our duty to the nation and the crown. Her words carried the weight of lived history and hard-won wisdom. She had seen the monarchy adapt and evolve through decades of social change, always finding ways to remain relevant while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. The current crisis was serious, but it was not insurmountable if they could summon the courage to make the necessary sacrifices. Edward, you have a choice to make, she continued, her voice softer but no less authoritative. You can accept the help your brother and sister-in-law are offering, commit to genuine recovery, and work to rebuild the trust you've shattered. Or you can continue on your current path and watch as your behavior destroys not just your own life but the institution that millions of people depend on for stability and continuity. The ultimatum was clear, and Edward's response would determine not just his own future, but the direction the monarchy would take in addressing internal threats to its survival. As he sat in silence weighing his options, the weight of history pressed down upon all of them, reminding them that their decisions would echo through generations and shape the crown's ability to serve the people who looked to it for leadership and inspiration. The emergency session of Parliament convened at Westminster Hall carried an atmosphere of gravity that reminded veteran political observers of wartime briefings and constitutional crises. Prime Minister Margaret Thornton sat across from King Alexander and Princess Elena in the secured conference room, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain as she contemplated the unprecedented situation facing the government and the monarchy simultaneously. Your Majesty, the Attorney General has reviewed the constitutional implications of your proposed actions regarding Prince Edward, and I must advise you that we're entering completely uncharted legal territory, Prime Minister Thornton began, her voice measured but tense. While the sovereign certainly has the authority to remove titles and alter succession rights, the formal process requires parliamentary approval and coordination with the Commonwealth realms, which could take months or even years to complete. Alexander leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as he absorbed the complexity of the legal framework surrounding his brother's situation. The monarchy operated within a delicate balance of tradition, constitutional law, and political reality, and any major change required navigating multiple layers of government approval and international consultation. The urgency of the crisis, however, meant they couldn't afford the luxury of extended deliberation. Prime Minister, with respect, we may not have months or years, Elena interjected diplomatically. The intelligence services have confirmed that Prince Edward's associations pose an ongoing security risk, and the media attention is intensifying by the hour. Every day we delay action is another day that the monarchy's credibility suffers irreparable damage. Sir James Morrison, who had been coordinating with various government departments throughout the morning, stepped forward with a stack of briefing documents. The Home Secretary has expressed particular concern about Prince Edward's access to sensitive information through his ceremonial roles and family connections. There's a growing consensus within the security apparatus that immediate action is necessary to prevent potential intelligence breaches. The weight of national security concerns added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. The royal family's involvement in state ceremonies, diplomatic functions, and classified briefings meant that any member who posed a security risk could potentially compromise Britain's relationships with allies and expose sensitive operations to hostile actors. Prime Minister Thornton opened her own folder and extracted several official documents. The cabinet has met in emergency session and agreed to support extraordinary measures if they're deemed necessary for national security. However, the opposition parties are already raising questions about the precedent this would set and the potential for political manipulation of royal succession laws. Alexander understood that his actions would be scrutinized not just for their immediate impact, but for how they might be used by future governments or monarchs to manipulate succession rights for political gain. The constitutional monarchy system depended on clear boundaries between royal prerogatives and political interference, and any blurring of those lines could destabilize the entire framework of British governance. What specific mechanisms do we have for immediate action while the formal legal processes are being completed? Elena asked, her diplomatic experience evident in her ability to focus on practical solutions rather than getting lost in constitutional theory. The Attorney General, who had been listening intently from across the room, cleared his throat before responding. Your Majesty, there are emergency provisions that allow for the temporary suspension of an individual's royal privileges and ceremonial duties pending investigation of security concerns. These measures could be implemented immediately while the Parliament considers the formal constitutional changes. The emergency provisions represented a compromise that would allow them to address the immediate crisis while maintaining respect for constitutional processes. However, Alexander knew that using these measures would inevitably trigger intense scrutiny from opposition politicians, media commentators, and constitutional scholars who would question the precedent being set. The Commonwealth realms have been informally briefed on the situation. Sir James added, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have indicated they would support whatever decision His Majesty deems necessary for the stability of the Crown. But several smaller realms have requested formal consultation before any final decisions are made. The international dimension of the crisis reminded everyone present that the British monarchy wasn't just a domestic institution, but the constitutional head of state for multiple sovereign nations. Any changes to succession laws or royal privileges would require coordination with Commonwealth governments, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging process. Elena stood and walked to the window overlooking the Thames, her silhouette framed against the grey London sky as she contemplated the broader implications of their decisions. We're not just making choices about Edward's future, she said quietly. We're defining how the monarchy will adapt to modern challenges and whether it can maintain its relevance in an era when transparency and accountability are demanded from all public institutions. Her observation struck at the heart of the constitutional questions they were grappling with. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing social, political, and economic circumstances. But the current crisis was testing whether it could evolve quickly enough to address threats that emerged from within its own ranks. Prime Minister Thornton leaned back in her chair, her expression reflecting the weight of the decisions before them. Your Majesty, I must also inform you that the opposition leader has requested an emergency debate in the Parliament regarding the handling of this crisis. There are concerns being raised about transparency, due process, and the potential for abuse of royal prerogatives. The prospect of parliamentary debate added another public dimension to what the royal family had hoped to handle with discretion and dignity. Alexander understood that democracy required public accountability, but he also knew that extensive political debate could further damage the monarchy's reputation and provide ammunition for Republican movements that sought to abolish the crown entirely. What timeline are we facing for these various processes? Alexander inquired, his strategic mind working to coordinate the multiple moving parts of the crisis response. Sir James consulted his notes before responding. The emergency measures could be implemented within 48 hours, with proper documentation and security justification. Formal parliamentary consideration of constitutional changes would require at least 6 weeks for proper deliberation and committee review. Commonwealth consultation could extend that timeline by several months, depending on the complexity of their own constitutional requirements. The timeline revealed the fundamental tension between the need for immediate action and the requirements of constitutional process. Alexander and Elena found themselves caught between the urgent demands of crisis management and the slower pace of legal and political institutions that were designed to prevent hasty decisions with far-reaching consequences. "There's another consideration we haven't fully addressed," Elena said, turning back to face the room. "Public opinion. The polling data suggests that while there's significant concern about Prince Edward's behavior, there's also sympathy for him as someone struggling with addiction and mental health issues. How we handle this crisis will significantly impact public perception of the monarchy's compassion and justice." The public relations dimension of the crisis was perhaps as challenging as the constitutional and security aspects. The royal family needed to demonstrate both decisive leadership and human compassion, showing that they could make tough decisions while still caring for family members who were struggling with serious personal problems. Prime Minister Thornton nodded thoughtfully. The government's polling shows similar results. There's strong support for accountability and consequences, but also expectation that Prince Edward will receive appropriate treatment and support. The public wants to see justice tempered with mercy, which makes the messaging around any formal actions extremely important. As the meeting continued late into the evening, Alexander felt the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. The decisions made in this room would not only determine his brother's fate, but would establish precedents for how future monarchs would handle internal threats to the crown's stability and credibility. The survival of the institution he had sworn to protect depended on finding the right balance between family loyalty and public duty, between tradition and adaptation, between compassion and accountability. The constitutional crisis they were navigating would test every aspect of Britain's governmental system, from the emergency powers of the sovereign to the oversight responsibilities of Parliament, from the security protocols of intelligence services to the diplomatic relationships with Commonwealth partners. Alexander understood that emerging from this crisis successfully would require not just political skill and constitutional knowledge, but the kind of moral courage that had sustained the monarchy through its darkest hours in the past. The morning of the royal announcement dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood within Buckingham Palace as King Alexander and Princess Elena prepared to face the most challenging press conference of their reign. The palace's media relations team had worked through the night to craft a statement that would balance transparency with dignity, accountability with compassion, and institutional preservation with family loyalty. Sarah Mitchell, the palace's director of communications, stood before the assembled team in the Queen's private study, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the sleepless nights that had consumed the senior staff since the crisis began. "The international media response has been unprecedented," she reported, her voice hoarse from countless phone briefings and strategy sessions. "We have over 400 credentialed journalists requesting access to the press conference, including representatives from major networks in America, Europe, and the Commonwealth realms." Elena reviewed the final draft of the statement one last time, her diplomatic training evident in the careful attention she paid to every word and phrase. The document had been reviewed by constitutional lawyers, security advisors, and international relations experts to ensure it struck the right tone while avoiding any language that might create additional legal or political complications. "The key message must remain consistent," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what lay ahead. "We are taking decisive action to protect the integrity of the monarchy while ensuring that Prince Edward receives the help he needs to address his personal struggles. This is about institutional responsibility, not family punishment." The distinction was crucial because public perception would largely determine whether the royal family emerged from this crisis with enhanced credibility or suffered long-term damage to their reputation and relevance. Alexander understood that the monarchy's survival depended not just on constitutional law and political support, but on maintaining the trust and respect of ordinary citizens who look to the crown for stability and moral leadership. Sir James Morrison entered the study carrying a tablet displaying real-time social media monitoring and public opinion polling data. The initial public response has been mixed but generally supportive of strong action, he reported. 63% of respondents support removing Prince Edward from royal duties pending treatment, while 71% believe the king is handling the crisis appropriately. However, there's significant concern about the precedent being set and questions about due process. The polling data provided some reassurance that their approach was resonating with the public. But Alexander knew that opinion could shift rapidly depending on how events unfolded over the coming days and weeks. The modern media landscape meant that every statement, gesture, and decision would be analyzed, criticized, and debated across multiple platforms simultaneously. Elena walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard, where she could see the gathering crowds of journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers who had assembled despite the early hour and unpleasant weather. The scene reminded her of other momentous occasions in royal history, both triumphant and tragic, when the monarchy had been forced to confront fundamental questions about its purpose and relevance. The international reaction will be particularly important, Elena observed thoughtfully. Our relationships with Commonwealth governments and European royal families could be significantly impacted by how this situation is perceived abroad. We need to demonstrate that we're acting responsibly and in accordance with constitutional principles, not arbitrarily or vindictively. The global dimension of the crisis reflected the monarchy's unique position as both a British institution and an international symbol of continuity and tradition. Royal families across Europe were watching closely to see how Alexander and Elena navigated the challenge, knowing that their approach might influence how similar crises were handled in other constitutional monarchies. As they prepared to leave for the press conference, Alexander paused at his father's portrait, remembering the quiet dignity and steady leadership that had characterized the previous reign. His father had always emphasized that the monarchy's strength came from its ability to place duty above personal feelings, to serve the nation's interests even when doing so required painful personal sacrifices. "Your Majesty," Sarah Mitchell said quietly, "there's been a development that you need to know about before facing the press. Prince Edward has issued a statement through his personal lawyer, expressing his disagreement with the family's decision and suggesting that he's being treated unfairly. The statement was released 20 minutes ago, and journalists will certainly ask about it." Alexander's jaw tightened as he processed this latest complication. Edward's decision to make a public statement without coordinating with the palace represented another breach of protocol and potentially undermined the carefully crafted narrative they had developed to explain the situation to the public. "What specifically did he say?" Elena asked, her diplomatic instincts immediately recognizing the potential for Edward's statement to create additional problems for their crisis management strategy. Sarah consulted her tablet before responding. "He claims that his gambling was recreational rather than compulsive, denies any knowledge of his associates' criminal activities, and suggests that the family is using the situation as an excuse to remove him from succession for political reasons. He also indicates that he's considering legal action to challenge any formal removal of his titles." The threat of legal action introduced yet another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. A public legal battle between Edward and the Crown would inevitably become a media spectacle that could drag on for months, providing ongoing ammunition for critics of the monarchy, and creating uncertainty about succession rights that could destabilize the entire constitutional framework. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, drawing upon the inner strength that had sustained him through years of public service and personal challenges. "Then we proceed as planned," he said firmly. "Edward's statement only reinforces the necessity of our actions. We cannot allow personal feelings or family dynamics to override our responsibility to the institution and the people we serve." The press conference was held in the palace's grand ballroom, its ornate setting providing a backdrop that emphasized the historical weight and constitutional significance of the announcement. Alexander and Elena took their seats at the mahogany podium that had been used for royal announcements for over a century, its presence lending gravity and continuity to the moment. As Alexander began reading the prepared statement, his voice carried the authority and composure that had made him an effective monarch during his 5 years on the throne. "Today, I am announcing the immediate suspension of Prince Edward's royal titles and ceremonial duties pending his successful completion of comprehensive treatment for gambling addiction and substance abuse issues. This decision has not been made lightly, but it is necessary to protect the integrity of the crown and ensure the security of our nation. The reaction from the assembled journalists was immediate and intense, with hands shooting up across the room as reporters sought to ask follow-up questions about the unprecedented nature of the action and its implications for royal succession rights. The energy in the room was electric, charged with the recognition that they were witnessing a historic moment that would be studied and debated for decades to come. Elena fielded questions about the legal and constitutional processes involved, her expertise in international relations evident in her clear explanations of how the decision would be coordinated with Commonwealth governments and other constitutional partners. Her calm, measured responses provided reassurance that the action was being taken thoughtfully and in accordance with established legal frameworks. When asked about Prince Edward's statement challenging the family's decision, Alexander's response was firm but compassionate. Prince Edward is struggling with serious personal issues that require professional treatment and support. While we respect his right to express his views, our primary responsibility is to the monarchy as an institution and to the millions of people who depend on its stability and integrity. Family loyalty cannot override constitutional duty. The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours, with journalists asking detailed questions about everything from the specific security concerns that had prompted the action to the precedent it would set for future royal crises. Alexander and Elena handled each question with the professionalism and dignity that had characterized their approach throughout the crisis, demonstrating the kind of steady leadership that the public expected from their sovereign. As they left the ballroom, both Alexander and Elena understood that the press conference marked the beginning rather than the end of their challenge. The public and political response to their announcement would determine whether they had successfully protected the monarchy or created new problems that could threaten its long-term survival. 6 months after the constitutional crisis that had threatened to destabilize the monarchy, King Alexander stood in the gardens of Balmoral Castle, watching the Scottish Highlands stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The autumn colors painted the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, creating a scene of natural beauty that had provided solace to generations of his family during their most challenging moments. The peaceful setting offered a stark contrast to the tumultuous period that had tested every aspect of his leadership and the institution he had sworn to protect. Princess Elena joined him on the terrace, carrying 2 cups of tea and moving with the graceful confidence that had made her such an effective partner in modernizing the monarchy's role in contemporary British society. The past months had strengthened their partnership in ways neither had anticipated, proving that their shared commitment to duty and service could withstand even the most severe pressures that royal life could impose. The latest polling data from Sir James shows remarkable results, Elena said as she handed Alexander his tea. Public approval for the monarchy has actually increased by 12 percentage points since we took action regarding Edward. The public seems to appreciate decisive leadership and transparency, even when it involves making difficult family decisions. Alexander nodded thoughtfully, still amazed by how the crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the crown's position. The decisive action they had taken, combined with their commitment to transparency and accountability, had demonstrated that the monarchy could evolve and adapt to modern expectations while maintaining its essential dignity and purpose. The Commonwealth response has been equally positive, he reflected. The Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have all expressed support for how we handled the situation, and several have indicated they're considering similar reforms to their own constitutional frameworks to address potential royal scandals more effectively. The international support had been crucial in validating their approach and ensuring that the constitutional changes would be recognized and respected by all the realms where Alexander served as head of state. The careful coordination with Commonwealth governments had prevented the kind of constitutional fragmentation that could have resulted from unilateral action by the British Crown. Elena settled into the chair beside him, her gaze following his across the magnificent Highland scenery. Edward's progress in treatment has been encouraging as well. Dr. Hoffman says he's finally accepting responsibility for his actions and engaging seriously with the therapeutic process. It may take years, but there's real hope for his recovery and eventual rehabilitation. The news about Edward's treatment provided the personal satisfaction that had been largely absent during the public and political aspects of the crisis. Alexander had never stopped loving his brother, despite the pain and disappointment caused by his destructive behavior. The prospect of eventual reconciliation and Edward's return to productive life offered hope that their family could heal, while the monarchy emerged stronger from the ordeal. Sir James Morrison approached across the terrace, his characteristic efficiency evident even in the relaxed setting of the royal family's private retreat. He carried a leather portfolio containing the final reports on the crisis resolution and the long-term reforms that had been implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Your Majesty, the Parliamentary Committee has completed its review of the emergency procedures used during the crisis, Sir James reported. They've recommended formalizing many of the protocols we developed, creating a clear framework for future situations that might threaten the security or integrity of the Crown. The parliamentary validation of their approach represented the final piece of constitutional legitimacy that Alexander had sought throughout the crisis. By working within existing legal frameworks while demonstrating the need for reform, they had achieved lasting change without undermining the democratic principles that governed the relationship between the monarchy and elected government. The new protocols will provide future monarchs with clear guidance on how to address internal threats while maintaining proper consultation with Parliament and the Commonwealth, Elena observed. It's remarkable how a crisis that could have destroyed the monarchy has actually strengthened its institutional framework and provided tools for addressing similar challenges. Alexander reflected on the irony that his brother's destructive behavior had ultimately catalyzed positive change that might never have occurred under normal circumstances. The monarchy had been forced to confront fundamental questions about accountability, transparency, and adaptation that had been postponed for decades, and the answers they had developed would serve the institution well into the future. The media coverage has evolved significantly as well, Sir James continued. The initial sensationalism has given way to more thoughtful analysis of the constitutional implications and the precedent being set for other royal families. Several major publications have praised the King and Princess Elena for their leadership during the crisis. The shift in media coverage reflected broader public recognition that Alexander and Elena had handled an unprecedented situation with grace, dignity, and effectiveness. Their willingness to prioritize institutional integrity over personal comfort had resonated with citizens who expected their leaders to make difficult decisions when necessary. Elena opened her own folder containing correspondence from various international partners and allies. We've received formal commendations from the European Union, NATO leadership, and several heads of state who appreciated our transparency about the security concerns and our commitment to addressing them promptly and effectively. The international recognition validated their decision to prioritize national security and constitutional integrity over family loyalty. The monarchy's role in diplomatic relationships and international cooperation meant that any compromise of royal security could have far-reaching consequences for Britain's global partnerships and influence. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Highlands, casting long shadows across the castle grounds, Alexander felt a profound sense of satisfaction at having navigated the crisis successfully while emerging with the monarchy stronger and more relevant than before. The painful decisions required to protect the crown had ultimately demonstrated its continued vitality and importance in modern British society.
The Queen Mother called this morning, Elena mentioned with a slight smile. She wanted to express her pride in how we handled the situation, and her belief that we've set an important precedent for future generations of royals. She said it reminded her of the difficult decisions made during the war years, when personal sacrifice was required for the greater good. The approval of Queen Mother Victoria carried special weight because of her long experience with royal crises and her deep understanding of the monarchy's role in British history. Her recognition that their actions had honored the crown's traditions while adapting to contemporary challenges provided validation from the person whose judgment Alexander valued most. Edward sent a letter as well, Alexander said quietly. He thanked us for forcing him to confront his problems and acknowledged that our actions probably saved his life. He understands now that the monarchy is bigger than any individual, including members of the royal family. The personal reconciliation with Edward represented the final healing that Alexander had hoped for throughout the crisis.
The knowledge that his brother recognized the necessity and compassion behind their difficult decisions provided closure to the painful family dimensions of the constitutional crisis. As they prepared to return to London the following day, both Alexander and Elena understood that they had fundamentally changed the monarchy's approach to internal challenges while strengthening its relevance and credibility for future generations. The crisis that had initially threatened to destroy the crown had ultimately demonstrated its resilience, adaptability, and continued importance in providing stability and moral leadership for the nation. The precedent they had established would guide future monarchs in balancing family loyalty with constitutional duty, personal compassion with institutional integrity, and traditional values with contemporary expectations. Their willingness to make the hardest choices when the monarchy's survival was at stake had proven that the crown could evolve and adapt while maintaining its essential character and purpose. The constitutional crisis was over, but the stronger, more accountable, and more transparent monarchy that had emerged from it would serve Britain and the Commonwealth for generations to come, proving that even the most challenging trials could ultimately strengthen institutions that were willing to learn, adapt, and place duty above personal interest.